The wind is doing 40 knots when I pull the tarp off the old radio. Rain is coming sideways through the boathouse door, and somewhere out past the breakwater, a flare goes up, a thin orange thread against a sky the color of a bruise. My hands are shaking, but not from the cold. I haven't touched this equipment in 11 years. 11 years of pretending it didn't exist. 11 years of letting my wife wrap it in a moving blanket and shove it behind the water heater every time her father came to visit. "Dan, what are you doing?" Claire is standing in the doorway, soaked through, her father's voice still echoing behind her from the house. Walter Ashford, 68 years old, self-made marina king of 3 counties, is on the phone with the Coast Guard station, screaming that nobody is doing enough, that his son and his 11-year-old grandson are somewhere out there in a 26-foot boat that should never have left the dock. I don't answer her right away. I flip the power switch on a marine transceiver I built and rebuilt with my own hands 20 years ago. Back when my call sign meant something. Back before I became just the radio repair guy that Walter Ashford introduced at Christmas parties like an apology. The unit hums to life. Old friend. Coast Guard sector, this is Golf Whiskey 6. 2 Charlie, radio check, over, I say, and my voice doesn't shake at all. There's a pause on the other end, a long one. Then a voice comes back, younger than mine. Careful. Golf Whiskey. 6-2 Charlie, that's an old rescue swimmer call sign. Who is this? Claire is staring at me like she's seeing a stranger. In a way, she is. She's seeing the man I used to be before I let her father talk both of us into burying him. Get me the search coordinates, I say. I know these waters better than anyone on your active roster. I've been swimming them since before some of your swimmers were born. Behind me, in the house, I can hear Walter still yelling into his phone about tax dollars and taxpayer-funded incompetence. He has no idea that the man he spent 11 years calling just a repairman is about to go out into a Category 2 gale to bring his son and grandson home. But to understand how we got here, to understand why my own wife hid the one thing that made me who I am, you have to go back, not to tonight. Back 6 years, to the first Thanksgiving Walter Ashford ever looked at me like I was something he'd tracked in on his shoe. My name is Daniel Reyes. Everyone calls me Dan. I'm 52 years old, and I live in a town called Millhaven on the Massachusetts coast, the kind of place where the fog rolls in every morning like it's punching a clock, and the harbor smells like diesel and low tide and something that, if you grew up here, smells like home. I spent 22 years in the United States Coast Guard. Started as a boat crewman right out of high school because I didn't have money for college, and the recruiter had a kind face and a straight answer for every question I asked him. By my late 20s, I'd made it into the rescue swimmer program, one of the hardest schools in the entire military, where they try to break you in a pool before they ever let you jump out of a helicopter into open water. I made it through, barely, some weeks, but I made it. I spent the next 15 years pulling people out of water that wanted to kill them. Fishermen whose boats capsized in October squalls. A family of 4 who drove off a bridge during a hurricane evacuation. A teenage boy who went under during a rip current on the 4th of July, while 300 people watched from the beach and did nothing but scream. I don't talk about most of it, not because it's classified or dramatic, just because talking about it makes other people uncomfortable. And I stopped needing to talk about it for myself a long time ago. I made peace with the water. That's the only way you survive doing that job for 22 years without it eating you alive. I retired at 44 with a bad shoulder, a good pension, and more commendations than I ever hung on a wall. My daughter Maddie was 12. My wife Claire, we'd been married 9 years by then, had been the one constant thread pulling me back to shore every single time I went out. She used to say she married a man who ran toward emergencies instead of away from them, and for a long time, she said it like it was the thing she loved most about me. After I retired, I didn't know how to sit still. So I opened a small shop in Millhaven, Reyes Marine Electronics, repairing and installing radios, GPS units, sonar, the guts of boats that keep fishermen and sailors alive when things go wrong. It's not glamorous work. I come home smelling like solder and salt water. My hands are permanently stained with something between grease and ink. I drive a 14-year-old pickup truck with a cracked windshield I keep meaning to fix. I'm not a big talker. I like quiet mornings with coffee on the back porch, watching the harbor wake up. I like fixing things that other people have given up on. I like my daughter's laugh, which sounds exactly like her mother's. I like knowing, in a town full of people who think they understand the ocean because they've seen it from a restaurant window, that I actually do. What I am not and never have been is impressed by money, which turned out to be a problem because 6 years ago, my daughter's godmother, my wife's college roommate, got married in a ceremony that Claire's father paid for entirely in cash. And that's the night I met Walter Ashford for real. Not just as the man at the head of the table during holidays, but as the man who was about to spend the next 6 years deciding I wasn't good enough for his daughter. The wedding reception was at the Millhaven Yacht Club, which Walter half-owned along with 2 marina developments up and down the coast. He'd built a real estate empire out of waterfront property starting in the 80s, and he wore that success like a second skin. Tailored blazers even at outdoor events, a signet ring, a handshake that lasted exactly 1 second too long, like he was testing your grip strength before deciding whether you deserved his attention. Claire brought me over to introduce me properly. We'd been dating 2 years by then. Married, if I'm being honest, was already the plan in both our heads, even if we hadn't said the word out loud yet. "Dad, this is Dan," Claire said, practically glowing. "Dan works on boats." Walter's eyebrows lifted about a quarter inch. "Works on boats," he repeated, like he was trying the phrase out to see if it tasted like anything. "Which marina?" "I'm not a dockhand," I said, and I said it evenly, no heat in it. "I was Coast Guard for 22 years, rescue swimmer. Now I run an electronics shop, radios, navigation systems." "Huh," Walter said. He looked at my hand where I was holding a glass of his top-shelf scotch, and something in his face closed like a door. "Coast Guard, government work." "Yes, sir." "Well," he clapped me once on the shoulder, already turning to greet someone more interesting arriving behind me. "Good for you, son. Good, honest work." That was it. That was the entire conversation. I remember standing there afterward, Claire's hand still in mine, and I remember thinking, that man just filed me away. Not as a threat, not as a person, as a category. Government work, good, honest work, the kind of phrase people use when they mean not real work. Claire squeezed my hand. "He's like that with everyone at first," she said. "He'll come around." I believed her. For 6 years, I kept believing her. 3 months after we announced our engagement, Claire's parents invited us to their house for a formal dinner. The kind with place cards and a caterer. even though it was just the four of us plus Claire's brother Nathan and his wife. Walter spent most of dinner talking about a new marina development he was closing on in Newport. $80 million. He said the number twice, like he wanted to make sure it landed both times. At one point, Claire's mother, a soft-spoken woman named Louise, who I liked immediately and who I think spent 35 years learning how to survive being married to Walter Ashford, asked me what exactly a rescue swimmer did. I told her, not dramatically, just the facts. Jumping from helicopters into open water, finding people who were drowning or trapped, bringing them back up on a cable while the ocean tried to take both of you down with it. Nathan, Claire's older brother, who worked in his father's company doing something with permits and zoning that he described at length and I still don't fully understand, leaned back in his chair and said, "So basically, you were a lifeguard with a helicopter." The table laughed, not cruelly. It wasn't meant as cruelty, not yet. It was the kind of joke a family makes about something they don't understand and don't particularly want to. I laughed too, because that's what you do. But Walter didn't laugh. He just watched me over the rim of his wine glass with an expression I would come to know very well over the following years. A kind of patient, quiet appraisal, like he was calculating exactly how many more years his daughter would spend married to a man who used to jump out of helicopters for a government salary before she came to her senses. "It's a dangerous job," Claire said, a little defensively, reaching for my hand under the table. "I'm sure it is," Walter said smoothly. "Dangerous jobs are for young men without better options." "Dan doesn't do that anymore, does he?" "No, sir," I said. "I run my own business now." "Good," Walter said, like that settled something important. "Good." Our wedding was small, at Claire's insistence, at a chapel near the harbor with maybe 60 guests. Walter paid for none of it. Claire wanted it that way, wanted something that was just ours. And I think that fact alone put him in a strange mood the entire day. During the toasts, Walter stood up with a glass of champagne and talked for almost 10 minutes about Claire's childhood, her achievements, her intelligence, her law degree from Boston College that she'd never actually practiced because she'd gone into nonprofit work instead, something Walter clearly still hadn't forgiven her for. Then he got to me. "And Dan," he said, raising his glass slightly in my direction, "welcome to the family. You've got 22 years of service behind you, and now you're starting a new chapter as a small business owner. I respect a man who works with his hands." He paused, and something in the pause felt deliberate. Claire always did have a soft spot for strays. The room laughed, a nervous, uncertain laugh, the kind that happens when people aren't sure if they just heard an insult. Claire's face went red. I felt my jaw tighten, but I kept my expression still, because it was my wedding day, and because making a scene would have proven every quiet assumption Walter Ashford had ever made about me, that I was rough, unrefined, one provocation away from losing control. So I raised my own glass instead, smiled, and said, "Thank you, Walter. I promise to take good care of her." And I sat down and I let it go, because that's what I told myself a bigger man would do. Claire apologized to me in the car afterward. "He didn't mean it like that," she said. And I remember looking at her and thinking, he meant it exactly like that. But I didn't say it. I just held her hand and told her it didn't matter. I told myself it didn't matter too. I was wrong both times. Incident 4. The erasure. This is the one that still sits heaviest in my chest even now. 2 years into our marriage, Walter was hosting a fundraising gala for a maritime museum. He sat on the board of a genuinely nice event, historic ships, model displays, a silent auction. Claire and I were invited, and I was actually looking forward to it because for once, this was an event about the ocean, about ships, about something I actually knew intimately. Walter had prepared a printed program with short biographies of the board members and notable guests. When I opened mine at our table, I found my own name in it, Daniel Reyes, husband of Claire Ashford Reyes, owner of a local marine electronics business. No mention of the Coast Guard. No mention of 22 years of service, of the swimmer badge, of the commendations sitting in a box in our closet. Just local business owner. Like I'd spent my whole life fixing radios and nothing before that had ever happened. I asked Claire about it quietly, later that night in the car. He didn't recommend you, Louise said quietly. I asked him why. Your record is extraordinary, Dan. I've seen the boxes. I've read some of the commendation letters when I was over at the house once, helping Claire clean the crawl space. You saved 41 people in your career. 41, Dan. That's not a small thing. I felt something in my chest tighten. What did he say? Louise looked down at her hands. He said, and I'm just repeating it, I don't agree with a single word. He said it would be, quote, complicated to feature his son-in-law prominently in a museum exhibit when people in his social circle already see the marriage as a step down for Claire. He said he didn't want to, quote, invite the comparison. I sat there in my own truck in the rain for a long moment, and something that had been slowly cracking for 6 years finally split all the way through. It wasn't the anger you'd expect. I want to be honest about that because I think people expect this part of the story to be rage, fists on the steering wheel, something loud. It wasn't. What I felt instead was a kind of grief, clean, quiet, and total. Grief for every dinner where I'd smiled through a joke about lifeguards with helicopters. Grief for a program with my name reduced to one flat sentence. Grief for a box of my own history shoved behind a water heater so an afternoon could go smoothly. And underneath the grief, something harder and more useful, clarity. I wasn't being tolerated because Walter Ashford was slow to warm up, the way Claire had promised for 6 years. I was being systematically erased because I didn't fit the story he wanted to tell about his daughter's life. And Claire, my Claire, who I loved more than anything on this earth, had been helping him do it. Not out of malice, out of 30 years of learning that the path of least resistance with her father was always silence, always smoothing, always making the uncomfortable thing disappear rather than making her father face it. I drove home that night with my hands steady on the wheel and my mind somewhere very far away, out over open water, the way it used to go right before a jump. I didn't say anything to Claire that night. I needed to think first. I needed to be sure of what I was seeing before I said it out loud, because once I said it, there would be no folding it back up small enough to fit behind the water heater again. I didn't confront anyone right away. That's not how I was trained to operate, and it's not who I am. When something goes wrong at sea, you don't act on instinct alone. You gather information, you assess conditions, you plan the approach, and only then do you go in. Panic gets people killed. Precision saves them. So for the next several weeks, I gathered facts, quietly, carefully. My daughter was 17 by then, sharp and observant in the way teenagers are when adults assume they're not paying attention. One evening, doing dishes together, I asked her carefully, neutrally, what she remembered about her grandfather and my old Coast Guard stuff. She stopped scrubbing a pot and gave me a look I wasn't expecting. Something between confusion and old, buried frustration. "Dad, Grandpa told my whole 8th grade class you were a—" I don't even remember the word he used. Something like a maintenance technician when he came to career day. I stood right there and didn't correct him because Mom told me before we left not to make it weird. She shook her head. I always thought that was so strange. Like, why would we not want people to know you used to save people's lives for a living? That's the coolest thing about you. I stood in my kitchen holding a dish towel, and I felt something in my chest crack open a little further. My own daughter had grown up learning the same lesson Claire had learned, that my history was something to manage, not something to be proud of. I called an old Coast Guard buddy of mine, Ray Petrosky, who still worked part-time doing outreach for veterans organizations along the coast. I asked him casually if he knew anything about the Maritime Museum's veteran exhibit. He did. He told me the museum had already interviewed 6 local veterans for the exhibit, and that my name had come up early in the planning, because Ray himself had suggested me, knowing my record, but that the suggestion had quietly disappeared from later meeting notes without explanation. Word around the board, Ray said carefully, was that a family member on the committee asked for it to be handled delicately. Nobody wanted to make waves, Dan. It's a small town. That confirmed what Louise had told me. It wasn't secondhand family gossip anymore. It was documented, corroborated, real. I understood something Walter didn't. I understood exactly how the Coast Guard's response would unfold. The assets available, the time it would take to mobilize a helicopter in these wind conditions, the search pattern they'd run based on Nathan's last known position and a rough drift calculation. I also understood something else. Those waters at low visibility, in a storm that had shifted directions twice in the last hour, were waters I had personally searched more times than almost anyone still on active duty. I went out to the garage. Claire followed me. She watched me pull the tarp off the transceiver, watched me pull my old dry suit, kept, absurdly, meticulously maintained for 11 years out of a habit I never let myself examine too closely, down from a hook in the corner. "Dan," she said, and her voice cracked. "What are you doing?" "I'm going to help find them," I said, checking the seals on the suit with hands that had done this 10,000 times before, hands that remembered the motion even after all these years. "I know this coastline better than the crew they're going to send. I know how the current runs past the breakwater in a nor'easter. I can cut hours off their search radius if I get on the water and give them real data. You're 52. You haven't done this in 11 years. The water hasn't changed," I said, "and neither have I. Not where it matters." I called the Coast Guard station directly, not 911, but the direct sector line, a number I still had memorized after 2 decades, and identified myself with my old call sign. There was a pause, then recognition, then something close to relief in the young petty officer's voice, because word of a missing family with a small child was already spreading fast through the local response network, and every asset mattered. "Golf Whiskey 6-2. Charlie, we have you on record. What's your position?" "I'm launching from Miller's Point in a rigid hull inflatable with a hand transceiver. I know this coastline. Give me the last known position and drift estimate. I'll run a parallel search pattern and report back." Walter was standing in the garage doorway by then, soaked from running out from the house, staring at me like he'd never seen me before in his life. Maybe he hadn't. Maybe this was the first time in 6 years he was actually looking at me instead of at the category he'd filed me under the night we met. "You," he said, and his voice had none of its usual command in it. It was small, frightened. "You're Coast Guard. You were a rescue swimmer." 22 years, I said, zipping the dry suit, checking the radio one more time. 41 people, Walter. That's how many I brought home before I retired. I would have been 42, but you decided that wasn't a story worth telling at your museum gala. I didn't say it to wound him. I want to be clear about that. I said it because it was, at that moment, simply true, and because there was no more time to soften it for anyone's comfort. Then I picked up my gear bag and walked to my truck. And Claire, soaked, shaking, her father standing frozen behind her in the rain, grabbed my arm. "Bring them home," she said. "Not be careful, not don't go, just bring them home." 11 years of hiding this part of me, and in the one moment it mattered most, she finally understood exactly what it was worth. I found Nathan and Charlie 40 minutes later, using nothing but memory of current patterns and a compass bearing, huddled together in a swamped cabin with the boat listing badly to port. I got a line on them, got Charlie into a harness first, always the child first, that instinct never leaves you, and had them both aboard a Coast Guard rescue boat within the hour, cold, terrified, but alive. Walter was waiting on the dock when we came in. He didn't say anything at first. He just grabbed his son and grandson in a hug so tight Charlie made a small surprised noise, and then over Nathan's shoulder, he looked at me standing there in a dripping dry suit that had U.S. Coast Guard stenciled faded across the chest, and something in his face finally, completely broke open. "Thank you," he said. His voice wasn't steady. "Dan, thank you." "You're welcome," I said, and then quietly, not cruelly, just honestly. "I've had that suit for 22 years, Walter. You've had 6 years to ask me a single question about it. Tonight's the first time you did." He didn't have an answer for that. For maybe the first time since I'd known him, Walter Ashford had absolutely nothing to say. The story made the local news the next morning. A retired Coast Guard rescue swimmer coming out of retirement to locate a missing family in a storm using nothing but memory, training, and a hand radio. The Millhaven Gazette ran my photo above the fold. The Maritime Museum Board, in what I can only describe as a scramble of embarrassment, called within the week to ask, with considerable urgency, whether I would still be willing to participate in their veteran exhibit. I said yes, not for Walter's sake, for mine, and for the 41 other names I could finally say out loud without anyone in my own family flinching at them. Walter's reaction in the days that followed wasn't dramatic. There was no big scene, no tearful public apology at a family dinner. That's not how a man like Walter Ashford operates, and honestly, I wasn't waiting for one. What happened instead was smaller, and, in its own way, more meaningful. He started asking me questions, real ones. What was the training like? What was the worst call I ever ran? Why did I choose electronics after I retired instead of something flashier? Louise told Claire, privately, that Walter hadn't slept properly for nearly a week after the rescue, replaying in his head how close he'd come to losing his son and grandson, and how the man he'd spent 6 years quietly diminishing was the only reason that didn't happen. I don't know exactly what went through his mind during those sleepless nights. I've never asked him directly, and I don't think he'd tell me even if I did. Some men process shame in rooms nobody else is allowed into. Claire changed the most and the fastest. In the weeks after the rescue, she went through the crawl space behind the water heater herself without me asking, and brought every piece of my old life back up into the light. The logbooks, the commendation letters, the retired equipment. She put my badge in a shadow box and hung it in our living room, dead center, where anyone who walked in would see it first. I should have done this years ago, she said, standing back to look at it. I'm sorry it took almost losing my brother and my nephew for me to stop being ashamed of the one thing about my husband I should have been proudest of. Nathan called me himself about 10 days after the rescue, a call I hadn't expected. He thanked me, of course, but he also apologized, unprompted, for the lifeguard with a helicopter comment from years earlier at that first family dinner. I didn't understand what that job actually was, he said. I do now. I'm sorry it took almost dying for me to get there. Maddie, my daughter, was the one who took it hardest in an unexpected way. Not sad, but angry. In the clean, righteous way 17-year-olds get angry when they finally understand an injustice that's been sitting under their nose the whole time. I'm so mad at Grandpa, she told me one night, and I'm a little mad at Mom too, honestly. You should never have had to prove yourself like that for people to finally respect you. She wasn't wrong. I told her so, but I also told her that respect earned under duress, however imperfect, was still a door opening where there had only been a wall before, and that what mattered now wasn't relitigating 6 years of small cruelties, but watching closely to see what everyone did with the door now that it was open. Walter came to my shop. Alone, no appointment, no phone call ahead of time. Which, if you knew Walter, was itself a kind of surrender because the man scheduled everything, controlled everything, arrived everywhere with an agenda. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking almost lost among the shelves of transceivers and GPS units and spools of marine-grade wire. I don't know anything about any of this, he admitted, gesturing vaguely at the shop around him. I never asked. You're welcome to ask now, I said. He did. For almost an hour, he asked me questions about the equipment, about the shop, about the 22 years I'd spent before it. It wasn't an apology, not in so many words, but it was Walter Ashford, for the first time in 6 years, treating my life like something worth understanding instead of something to be managed. The museum exhibit opened. I stood in front of a display case with my name on it. Daniel Reyes, U.S. Coast Guard, rescue swimmer, 22 years of service, 42 lives, the number updated now to include Nathan and Charlie. And Walter stood beside me at the opening reception, introducing me to his business associates, not as Claire's husband, runs a little electronics shop, but as my son-in-law, a genuine hero, saved my grandson's life. I noticed he still couldn't quite say Coast Guard without a small hitch in his voice, like the words cost him something, but he said them, every time. That mattered. I won't pretend the wound closed all the way. Some things don't. There's still a version of me that remembers exactly how it felt to stand at my own wedding and hear myself described as a stray Claire had taken pity on. That memory doesn't disappear just because the man who said it finally learned to say something kinder. But I've made peace with that the way I made peace with the ocean a long time ago. You don't forget what it took from you. You just learn to stop needing it, to apologize before you can move forward. By early spring, something had shifted permanently in our family's rhythm. Walter started coming to the shop on slow Tuesday afternoons, just to sit and talk, sometimes about the business, more often now, about nothing in particular. the weather, Charlie's Little League season, an old boat he was thinking about restoring. Small talk. Ordinary talk. The kind of talk that only happens between people who've stopped performing for each other. Claire and I went to counseling together for a few months, not because our marriage was in danger, but because 6 years of small erasures don't get resolved by one dramatic night on the water. We needed the slower work too, the unglamorous, unphotographed work of rebuilding trust in small, deliberate pieces. She learned to speak up to her father in the moment, not just after the fact. I learned to stop absorbing silence as the price of peace. Maddie decided that spring that she wanted to shadow me at the shop on weekends, and eventually asked whether the Coast Guard still ran youth programs for kids interested in maritime service. I told her they did. I watched something light up in her face that reminded me powerfully of the young man I used to be. 22 years old, standing at a recruiting office with nothing but a strong pair of shoulders and a willingness to jump into water other people ran from. If you're watching this and you've spent years being quietly diminished by someone whose approval you kept hoping to earn, a parent, an in-law, a boss, doesn't matter who, I want you to hear this clearly. You don't have to shrink yourself to keep a difficult relationship comfortable. Not for one dinner, not for one photograph, not for one program booklet with your name reduced to a single flat line. The people who truly value you don't need you to hide the parts of yourself that make them feel small by comparison. And if someone does need that from you, if they only seem to love you on the condition that you stay quiet about who you really are, that's not love asking you to compromise. That's control wearing love's clothes. I never wanted a storm to be the thing that made my father-in-law finally see me. I would have much rather he simply asked one ordinary Tuesday, years earlier, what my life had actually been. But sometimes the truth only surfaces when the water gets rough enough that nobody can keep pretending it's calm. Not every family gets a night like that one. Not every story ends with the person who diminished you standing on a dock, finally understanding exactly who you were the whole time. Some of you are going to have to be the one who says it out loud first, without waiting for a crisis to hand you permission. Say it anyway. Bring your radio up out of the crawl space. Put your name back in the program. You don't need anyone's storm to prove your worth. You only need your own steady hands and the courage to stop letting silence speak for you. If this story meant something to you, I'd be grateful if you shared it with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you've ever had to fight to be seen by the people closest to you, tell me about it in the comments. I read every single one. Thank you for listening. I'll see you in the next story.